I'm so excited to have with us, I think, one of America's leading scholars in this area of criminal justice and looking at the criminal justice system, what it has meant and its impact on African Americans. As is customary push, we've been looking at reforming the criminal justice system, starting with arrest, detention, prosecution, every stage of the process, and even looking at some of the laws that are on the books and how African American men and women are treated by the judicial system in comparison with other races. In particular, how we are treated differently than our Caucasian counterparts. And so I thought it would be interesting, as we have this criminal justice panel that you will hear from, to hear from one of the scholars who's been writing in this area, who's done a lot of research in this area. And for the first time, many of you will meet him for the first time, Professor Arthur Garrison. And he'll tell you a little bit about himself as we look to delve more deeply into these two books that he has written. Dr. Garrison.
Hello, and pleasure, and thank you for having me. Again, my name is Arthur Garrison. I'm a professor at Kutztown University, and I've written two books dealing with race and crime and criminal justice, Race and Criminal Justice History, and Chained to the System. Both of these books engage in looking at the historical development of the American criminal justice system. Chained to the System specifically looks at the recent history of the criminal justice system starting in the 1960s, and then with the rise of the get tough on crime and the law and order rhetoric, which has basically been the foundation of modern criminal justice rhetoric, starting with Nixon through Reagan and Bush, Clinton, Bush again, and then with the return of rehabilitation as an acceptable rhetorical political model with President Obama, and then ending with the First Step Act signed by President Trump. So the book looks at rhetoric, in other words, the story of criminal justice, the story of the policy behind criminal justice.
So when you say the story behind criminal justice, give me an example of one of the stories that you talk about in your book.
I talk about how, for example, I argue in the book that if you look at modern political rhetoric starting in the 1960s, to make a very long story short, the criminal justice system became the new model for social policy dealing with urban crime. And the answer to that rhetoric, to that question, what do we do about urban crime, was that we had the get tough policies of Nixon and the rise of the DEA in 1973. And then Reagan came in 1980. Now, I argue that to understand criminal justice policy, you have to understand general American politics. So by the 1980s, the social conservatives had fully taken control of the Republican Party. And that during 81, 82, and 83, the culture wars had kicked in. One of the factors of the culture wars was criminal justice. The idea that the criminal justice system was not working. The criminal justice system was being soft on criminals and letting criminals out on bail, the various conversations that we're still having today. So in 1984, the Republicans, with Democratic support, which is another topic all by itself, how that happened, passed the 1984 Crime Act. And that is one of the two foundations of modern criminal justice that we have. That, along with the crime bill signed by Clinton in 94. So
let's hold it right there. You mean to tell me that in this book, you have been able to look at the policies that are driven by the executive branch of government and how they have impacted what you and I know to be the judicial branch of government, because it's the system for enforcing the laws that are placed on the books.
Yes, I have. The point of the book actually it starts with 1619, the slave codes, the black codes, the rise of Jim Crow, why Jim Crow came into existence, why it matters as a policy matter and then a criminal justice matter, and then the modern development of criminal justice system starting in the 1950s and 60s. And I trace that development chronologically and conceptually, both criminal justice and general policy, all the way through the first 2 years of the presidency of Donald Trump. And so I put into context the 1984 Crime Act, which gave us the 100-to-1 crack powder cocaine ratio, and then and then followed that up with the mandatory minimum 5 years, followed by the Clinton administration, and among other things is truth in sentencing, which pretty much finished off the fall of probation, as well as the overruling of the Sentencing Commission in 1995, which would have adjusted the 100-to-1 ratio, but Clinton specifically got a statute passed to override the Sentencing Commission. The only time this happened before or since. And so I traced that history along with attorneys general's policies of dealing with the issue of gun crimes and how you can elevate crimes from a drug charge to a drug charge with guns, and that can add 10, 15 years by itself. So I discussed those policies
I hate to
and the
keep
history behind it.
I hate to keep interrupting because you got so much information. What made you write this book?
I wrote this book. I teach criminal justice history, and I wanted a book that put politics, sociology, psychology, legal history, all in the same book to explain the overall package. And I hadn't found a book that did that. And so that is how Chained to the System came into existence. It's a follow-up to my book, Race and Criminal Justice History, which is more of a textbook, which is much more detailed in political rhetoric.
So I am just really interested and fascinated by this kind of research because we've had Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, which talks about mass incarceration situation. And so your book gets us, before we go to sentencing and incarceration, it deals with how these policies help shape and fuel what happens in the criminal justice system.
Yes, I try and the book is a holistic book that covers all of those issues, and I try and address it in a story form. So, and it's also written chronologically, so the reader would be able to get a overall view of the history of criminal justice in America and very specific issues within that issue. I also go into Supreme Court jurisprudence and explain that the Supreme Court is also a player in the get tough on crime era in the 1980s. And that is why, among other things, Fourth Amendment law dealing with use of force, as well as qualified immunity, is more of a judicial created issue than it is legislative. Now, legislature can solve that, and that's what's going on in Congress as we speak, and it's bogged down on the issue of qualified immunity. But how qualified immunity functions is actually a judicial creation by the Supreme Court starting in the early 1970s, and how they read the statute to give police officers a practical immunity in use of force cases.
That's important because almost every police department across the country, the states have passed these laws now which support qualified immunity for police officers. Many of us are trying to eliminate it because it says a police officer could violate the law and not be subject to any criminal liability, not be subject to any civil liability. They may be incarcerated as we have in Chicago with and in Minneapolis with the police officers that found guilty of killing an unarmed African American, but they don't lose their pension rights. They don't lose something that any ordinary citizen would lose. And so when you did this research on qualified immunity, you found that the Supreme Court, in what case, started the qualified immunity initiative?
Well, you know, it all begins with Terry v. Ohio. And Terry v. Ohio established that the police officers can come and stop you without probable cause, reasonable suspicion. The whole genre of Fourth Amendment jurisprudence comes down to one word: unreasonable. Fourth Amendment says you have a right against unreasonable searches and seizures. The point is the Supreme Court has built the entire meaning of the Fourth Amendment around the word unreasonable. So it's a case, the court has said that any action done by police, use of force, the focus is case by case analysis. In this particular case, and with these particular facts, did the police officers act unreasonably? So the law is not where the court has said that you cannot say, if the police stop you without a warrant, that's unreasonable. The court has said if the police stop you under A, B, C, D, E, and F facts, was that unreasonable? The fact that they had a warrant or didn't have a warrant doesn't settle the question. And so in the book, I walk through that jurisprudence history of how that happened. And I also walk through the jurisprudence history of the Supreme Court generally interpreting the Fourth, Fifth, Sixth, and Eighth Amendments in such a way that they are more prone to law enforcement than protecting individual rights, because that was the season they were in the 1980s and 90s. The Supreme Court now is under a different philosophical viewpoint in dealing with the criminal justice amendments, Fourth, Fifth, Sixth, and Eighth Amendments. So now you're getting cases where the court is controlling police power. And the Supreme Court, I believe anyway, has decided it is not going to take any qualified immunity cases. They've had, in the last two terms, maybe 8, 9 really fundamental questions that would have actually achieved what the statute that's being debated in Congress would have achieved. But I think the Supreme Court has decided it's not handling any more of those cases. And so any change to qualified immunity is now going to have to happen in Congress. And part of my book talks about the limitations to using qualified immunity to control police behavior, because it's mostly made to protect officers.
So this means your book, every member of Congress needs to have a copy of your book, at least the Congressional Black Caucus, because it gives them the data, the tools they need to push forth this legislation. Perhaps every member of the state legislative bodies should have a copy of this book. Certainly, I never had this kind of analysis when I was in law school, and it would seem to me it would be a book that could be used in the criminal law classes, because it gives you a better understanding of why you're learning criminal procedure, and it gives you the historical frame of reference for criminal procedure and so forth. And certainly all of those students that say they're interested in criminal justice and so forth. This is like, I'm excited about this book. So how do people get your book?
The book is available on Amazon. That's probably the best way to secure a copy of the book. I reordered a few copies myself, and they can send it within a day. I recommend the book to anybody who wants to understand the interaction between criminal justice, policy, and American history, because I think one of the problems that we have in our public discourse about criminal justice is that it has no historical context, and nuances of criminal law and criminal procedure and criminal justice history are not really properly discussed. That's one of the reasons I wrote the book. for my students who are soon to be police officers and probation and parole officers. I wanted them to have a sense of the history behind. One final thing. One of the things I explain to my students is how and why African Americans and non-African Americans see the criminal justice system differently. In my book, I explained that it's a truism that the two see the criminal justice system fundamentally different. My point of my book is to explain why there is a difference.
Well, so I don't want to tell everything that's in the book. They need to read the book, get the book, and get the book now. The other thing I was wondering, we have a young man that we just met that was in solitary confinement for 24 years. Have you, in your research, looked at this whole idea of solitary confinement as a means of punishment or control that's used by prisons? Have you any idea?
You know, I don't know that case specifically, but generally, that's not constitutional on its face. On its face, you cannot use solitary confinement indefinitely. Now, you can use solitary confinement for a reasonable period of time, and as I said, that's case by case analysis.
That's
But
it, reasonable.
we're talking
What's
about
reasonable?
20 something years. That's just unconstitutional on its face.
Well, it wasn't unbroken, but they just kept putting him back in solitary confinement over a period. And the question is, how long is reasonable? And like you say, it's reasonable is the standard that is so ambiguous. It could be forever, given.
But yeah, the problem here's the thing with understanding reasonableness and Fourth Amendment issues generally, and then due process when talking about prisons, right? It's okay. What would a reasonable officer in that situation, with the facts that officer knows at the time,
Right.
would such an officer do that? And so the battle in these cases of court is, well, what would a reasonable officer in that situation, knowing what that officer knew, do at the time? And so the court has made it very clear that that's the standard. Now, the side problem, of course, is that if you're arguing that, you need to have a case that has a fact pattern that's almost identical to your fact pattern to argue that a reasonable officer would know he can't do that. And that has been a major problem with qualified immunity, because if you can't produce that case, you could lose in a motion to dismiss. That is what the act in Congress being debated would eradicate. But that's the only way to eradicate it, because the Supreme Court, my personal opinion, looking at their cases they're not taking, they are not going to revisit that question. So it belongs to Congress to deal with that question and remove that from qualified immunity, because that's one of the major protections that an officer would have. Yeah, what I did may have been wrong now, but then it wasn't. And Fourth Amendment is about then, not what the court says now, as far as liability.
Well, I'm so excited to have this conversation with you. I got to finish reading your book now more than ever, because it has so much to offer for those of us who are working in the public policy spaces, for those who are beyond law school. I'm just thinking, you have so much that you've analyzed and researched. It would be helpful to have you testifying before Congress. I don't know if you've done it before these state legislatures, about issues, particularly about qualified immunity and why we need specific kinds of legislation. And have you ever been called to help shape legislation?
No, I have not been so fortunate to be invited to testify before Congress or a state congressional, a state legislative committee. I would be honored to do so, as well as to work with you and other organizations in dealing with the issues at hand, because you raised one very important point. Getting legislation in Congress is very important because it sets a general tone. But if you really want to put your hands into changing the criminal justice system, you have to go state down, because states can pass their own statutes. And as long as a statute does not go below what the Supreme Court says, The state can do whatever it wants. It can make more protections. It just can't provide less. So passing statutes on the state level limiting qualified immunity or changing statutes so people who want to seek civil address for abuse, it can be done on the state level, and then you sue in state court because you only have a qualified immunity issue if you go into federal court.
So this is the thing. We want you to be part of our criminal justice, National Criminal Justice Committee. As we seek to deal with police reform, we're looking at reforming a number of pieces of legislation in states across the country. You can help us shape that legislation. And I think that you are an unbelievable resource. I know you have a lot on your plate today, but we want to add Rainbow Push to your plate. Thank you so very much for joining us. How can people reach you?
People can reach me at my email. That's the best way. Garrison@kutztown.edu. Best way to contact me is through my email because I'm always looking at it.
And so you're a tenured professor where?
Yes, I'm a full professor at Kutztown University, Kutztown, Pennsylvania.
Kutztown, Pennsylvania, on the East Coast. Thank you so much. We'll be talking and sharing. I hope you will watch, and we will I'll give you some information. I'll send you some information.
Thank you very much.